So we had a video recommended by R on our Discord. If you don't know, our Discord is for YouTube members and Twitch subs. If you connect your accounts from those platforms onto your Discord, you get automatically invited to our Discord where we have a lot of fun. But R recommended a video from that boy Aqua, a YouTuber that does very good stuff. And that boy Aqua put together a video outlining and exploring some of the stuff that went down with Spider-Man 2. Now, Spider-Man 2 is one of the weirder games that's launched in the last handful of years. If you are not familiar with it somehow. Basically, it was a game that cost $300 million and was extremely expensive. And it was good. It was good. Like, it wasn't a bad game, but it's one of the most, and I mean this in the pure sense of the word, it's one of the most like unremarkable games I've played this generation. You know, like there's not much to say about it. It's just kind of like, yep, I played it. Thought it was like pretty good. It was flashy. It was, pretty, ran okay. Like, there's just not a lot to say. Yeah, Master says it was good enough. Yep, it's a game. It was very okay. That's the feeling I think a lot of people have. I think narratively it was a big swing and a miss, which is what this video is going to explore. I think they bit off more than they could chew in a lot of ways. They also had this weird obsession with Mary Jane. There was an interview from the game director where he specifically said that he wanted to make Mary Jane one of the heroes in this story, which I thought was kind of weird because like Mary literally is not a superhero, and then like we're gonna like obsessively try to do it. And as we'll see, and if you played the game, you know that they found ways to try and kind of push her into being sort of a superhero. But I think they also bit off more than they could chew, just in the context and sense that they had Miles Morales and Peter Parker at the same time. So they literally have two superheroes, that share abilities and movement and traversal, and you have to try and give them roughly equal screen time and give them both arcs as characters and secondary casts that they're familiar with and that they're working with. And it just like, they bit off more than they could chew, I think. And so it just came out and it's largely been forgotten. Not many people talk about the game anymore, except sort of in this retro or this retrospective sense. And usually it's not to say really good things. I also insist, I think, that Spider-Man 2, if it had launched in 2024 or 2025, it would have been received very, very differently, because it had some of the most cringe, god-awful writing, especially with some of its secondary characters, like the podcaster and all this stuff. It was unbelievably cringe, and they somehow managed to bypass the blowback for it. If it had launched a year or two later, I think it would have been received much more negatively. And I think they got really, really lucky with it. It's just my personal opinion. But let's see what that boy Aqua has to say about it.
One of the biggest criticisms of Spider-Man 2 since launch was that Peter Parker was nerfed. What does this mean? Well, it simply means that he was weaker and more incompetent in Spider-Man 2 compared to Spider-Man 1 and Miles Morales. Some moments like the infamous fridge scene have become a symbol of this nerf, but
which, if you're not familiar, if you didn't play it or if you forgot, basically there's like a major moment in the story where, not to be too specific for sake of spoilers, but Peter should be saving people or someone right now because he's Spider-Man. You know, a superhero who can like stop trains and punch holes in buildings. And in this scene, a refrigerator falls on him and he can't move. What? But it's very conveniently set up this way, as I'm sure he's going to describe, and it's very contrived. And this was my feeling, and it has been, I think, the feeling of many people, which is that for whatever reason, I think there's numerous reasons, but they needed Peter to kind of be second tier in this game, and so they wrote, I think poorly, excuses for him to not be involved in major moments, because they needed Mary Jane to be the focus. They needed Miles to be the focus or whatever else. So they come up with these very kind of smooth-brained excuses for why Peter can't help right now. And it's just dumb, but we'll continue.
Symbol of this nerf. But the bigger question I want to answer is this criticism actually true? The answer is yes. Well, no, but yeah, sorta. It's complicated. So I want to take some time to look over Peter's performance over the first and second game and see if he really was nerfed, and more importantly, how. I think there are 3 ways to analyze how and why Peter might have been nerfed. There's the narrative sense, which is how often he justifiably loses, and then we can look at how Peter is thematically nerfed, looking at how he operates in the context of other characters, and finally, the time sense, where we can view how much Peter is nerfed in the context of screen time. Before we get started, we have to make something clear. People often say Peter was nerfed, but what they actually mean is that Spider-Man was nerfed. We say Peter so people don't assume we're talking about Miles, but we're talking about Peter's Spider-Man. For the sake of this video, we'll refer to Spider-Man purely in terms of Peter Parker's heroic persona, and we will only refer to Miles by the name Miles. This isn't because Miles isn't Spider-Man, okay? I'm not a freak, it's just for simplicity. Also, this
Dude, it's been so frustrating, and we're kind of coming out of it, but for a while there, it felt like if you critiqued Miles Morales or Spider-Man 2 at all, people insinuated, but usually passive-aggressively, that like you had a problem with Miles as Spider-Man, or like you were being problematic or something. And it's like, no, I really like Miles Morales the game. Like, I feel like Miles and Peter were both kind of screwed by being superheroes trying to share screen time in a game. Like, they should have been given their own games, dedicated games, where they can be the center of attention and be the focus and get full character arcs and all that. When you try to do both at the same time, it doesn't really work as well, in my opinion.
video was actually supposed to go on my second channel, That Guy Aqua, but it's going here so you guys can hear about said second channel. I've been covering superhero topics, mostly relating to Spider-Man and Batman, posting every Monday, and I hope to see you guys over there. Without further ado, let's see if Peter was actually nerfed. When I began researching for this video, my first step was to replay the game and look at all the times Peter loses. I then tried to categorize how he lost and if it was justified. A justifiable loss is considered as a moment where he does not feel, in the moment, nerfed as a means of giving the story stakes. For example, when he loses to the Sinister Six, that's totally justifiable. He's surrounded,
Makes
taking
sense.
a 1v5, and while he holds his own for a bit, it makes perfect sense that he loses here.
Yeah.
An unjustified loss is when in the burning building with May. Peter's strength is suddenly so weak that he virtually passes out as he falls into a burning building where, had Miles not caught him, he would have been burned alive. This to me is an unjustified loss, where
Well, because they need Miles to save him, and and this is like weak writing, period. It's also the same frustration I have with like The Last of Us Part 2, where everything is so contrived to end up with the conclusion they decided that it just feels overly forced and it just feels bad. You know, it's the same thing with like Abby, like walking around in the snowstorm, deciding to go off by herself, which is objectively a very stupid thing to do at the start of the game, leaving Owen. And then she goes off and happens to just stumble into not just other survivors to save her. She happens to stumble into the one person within that city she thought was in the city. She wasn't even sure. The one person in that city that she wanted to find for sake of revenge, and is able to convince them to go back to her base of operations, where they're able to lock him and get him in the basement where they can kill him. And it's just so convenient, you know, because they very, very carefully crafted it that way.
his strength, dexterity, and durability have been altered to give a moment stakes and push the idea that Spider-Man needs to rely on his friends. This is a common issue we see in plenty of superhero stories, and when it comes to Spider-Man, the biggest barrel of fish you can open is the spider sense. The moment you introduce his ability to sense and react to danger that he can't directly see, we open all kinds of possibilities for Peter to just have his senses nerfed because the villain needs to get the drop on him. I don't think this narrative issue is a big deal if it's done sparingly, and as long as it isn't too egregious. For example, when Otto defeats Peter with relative ease in their first encounter, he is able to, quite quickly, turn around and face him again, except this time defeat him, despite already being weakened. Where it becomes egregious is when he's shown to be defeated by unjustified reasons. To look at another example, we can see that Peter is able to take down both Rhino and Scorpion at the same time in the first game. However, in Miles Morales, Peter is soloed by Rhino to the point where, had Miles not been there, he would have died. Now, they do
Yeah, and it's literally like, again, it's just so lazy, where it's like, oh, he's now tired. And he now is laying down and doesn't have the strength to get up. Boom. It's just so lazy, you know? It's like you didn't even come up with a clever explanation. You didn't come up with some cool reason why he needed to sit out. It's just he's tired now. He's sleepy.
This so that Miles has a reason to step up and be pushed enough to unlock his Venom powers, but it makes no sense that Peter would be so easily battered by the Rhino like this. So with that in mind, let's look at all the ways Peter loses in the first game.
Well, and I think this is why a lot of people kind of rebelled against Spider-Man 2 and got really, really pissy about it, because it took a character that they respected and appreciated and then nerfed the crap out of him to the point where they didn't respect him and they didn't appreciate him, and they felt like he was being used as a punching bag to justify another character's arc, which again just feels bad. It's the same emotional response people had to Joel's death, because it was like, you just killed off Joel so that Abby could have her character arc of like revenge bad. And so they feel like you disrespected the character they knew and loved in service of another character, you know?
The first instance of Peter losing is when he is knocked out at City Hall. This is a perfectly justifiable way for him to lose. He wasn't prepared, did what he could, and ultimately wouldn't have been able to stop the bombing anyways. Another is when first coming face to face with Lee, where Spider-Man is pinned under a server rack after taking a direct blow. He didn't know about Lee's powers or how they worked, and the server rack was probably pretty heavy. I'd say justified. When Sable shows up, she traps Peter and he can't break out, even though he does that plenty in gameplay. I would say this is pretty unjustified, and is done to make Sable seem like a threat. He also loses to her again later in the game.
It's the cringiest thing when like something happens in a cutscene, but then in gameplay it's totally normal and fine. There's some exceptions where it's like you're introduced to a mini boss type class character, and the first time you see them, they're a main boss. You beat them, and then they become like a grunt enemy or a mini boss enemy later in the game. And it's like, okay, but you grew in power and capability, so what used to be a major challenge for you is now not that big of a deal. I can make an excuse out of that. I can like hand wave that away. But when it comes to this stuff where it's like literally in a cutscene, can't break free, I'm stuck. And then in a moment later in gameplay, when grunts are using the same weapon, you can easily break out of it. It's just dumb.
Next time is one against the Sinister Six. As mentioned, this is a perfectly fine reason to lose. Another instance is the burning building, and I believe it is unjustified. Spider-Man should have been able to get out of that. The next is one against Scorpion. This might seem unjustified because he loses without much effort, but it's explained that Scorpion is using a new serum developed by Otto, so it makes sense that the effects of it catch him off guard, so I consider this justified. Finally, he loses to Otto after his transformation, and as mentioned, this is justified. In total, Peter loses about 8 times throughout the story, and 5 of those times it is justified, leaving 3 instances where I believe Peter's power was capped in order to build up the story's antagonists. I'd say this is a very forgivable amount. We can see again that he loses to Rhino and Miles Morales, and while I won't count this game because Peter is hardly in it, I want to examine this scene because it highlights a big part of the problem, which is Insomniac will sometimes not remember that Peter needs to lose for a reason. If he lost to Rhino because Miles interfered and accidentally sabotaged him, then it wouldn't feel like Peter is just being nerfed to fit the narrative. Anyways, let's move on to Spider-Man 2.
Yeah, it's very, again, my frustration with Insomniac's writing is that it's very lazy. And I mean that in many different ways, but ultimately it's just they will have the most soft-brained excuse or justification for why something has to happen, and they won't try at all to justify it within the world or with the characters or anything. It's just lazy. So we need Peter to not interfere with this next gameplay sequence because we need Mary to have her reasons to do her stuff. Because if Peter was able to help, like there wouldn't be much challenge. It wouldn't make sense. So I don't know. Just do we have a fridge? Let's just put him under the fridge. Okay. And that's the extent of it. No consistency. That's the other thing. And that's part of why I say lazy is that they aren't even trying to think through, does this make sense? Is this justified based on other stuff we've done? When he had that building collapse on him, was that too much or was that something he could overcome? There's no attempt. It's just, whatever. Sure, sounds good.
Spider-Man 2 introduces a bit of a problem with our current methodology, which is that sometimes Peter can technically lose and win at the same time. And this comes up in the game's very introduction. When fighting Sandman, Peter falls into some...
It's not about lazy, it's about philosophy and intent. It was extremely purposeful. Oh, I'm not saying it wasn't purposeful. I'm saying it is very purposeful. They want, for one sequence, they need Miles to unlock his extra powerful attacks. I'm blanking on what they're called. But, like the yellow electric, whatever attacks. And so they need Peter to be incapacitated so he has a reason to unlock those. And they just are like, he's tired now. There you go. So it's purposeful. It's just really lazy. Like back when The Last of Us Part 1, for some reason I'm bringing up The Last of Us a lot today. But The Last of Us Part 1, Neil and the whole group of Naughty Dog designers and stuff that did press for The Last of Us before it launched, they said multiple times that Joel was the only playable character. They said multiple times, it's just Joel. Ellie is a side character. She's a sidekick, basically. You don't play as her. And then the game came out, and turns out you can play as Ellie. And they decided that they wanted the player to play as Ellie to experience the world through her eyes. They decided intentionally, they wanted, and purposefully, that they wanted her to be a playable character, but they needed a reason for her to be playable, other than just like swap characters now for some reason. And what they did is they created a narrative reason where Joel becomes injured in a believable way and is incapacitated medically. So she needs to step up. Now, on the flip side, in that case, they needed Joel to then go and save Ellie. And so he makes a miraculous recovery in the span of like an hour and a half, taking some medicine, and he's totally fine after being impaled. That's also contrived and forced for purposeful reasons. But my point is that you can do things purposefully in a story. I just want a little bit more effort than a fridge fell on him, than he's tired now. I want more effort than that. Like, at least try to justify it in the world. Try to justify it, you know, more than just the laziest of the laziest explanation.
At the same time. And this comes up in the game's very introduction. When fighting Sandman, Peter falls into some sand and has technically lost. He is saved by Miles, and without Miles, would have presumably suffocated. However, later in the fight, they win because Peter devises a plan using Miles' electricity, so he technically wins there, as without him, Miles would have lost. Again, in both cases, these scenes are written to highlight the benefit of having two heroes. In these niche cases, we will count it as both a win and a loss and keep it neutral. The next time we see Peter lose is at the amusement park, where he nearly fails to save a roller coaster of civilians before Harry shows up to save the day. Peter has lifted much heavier, so again, this is done to make Harry's entrance more dramatic. The next scene is one I'm conflicted on, and of course, it's where Peter is stabbed. Peter needs to lose to Craven so the narrative that he needs the suit can continue, but in this case, it would have been nice to see him put up more of a fight. I want to leave the scene neutral, because I don't think he was nerfed in this scene, but less so hardly allowed to participate. Similar sentiment to the church scene. Sure, Craven does initially get one over by ringing the bell, but Peter does destroy it, so if there was to be a fight, Craven would have likely gotten his shit rocked. Regardless, not counting it as a victory and leaving it neutral. The next time we see Peter lose is when we lose the symbiote suit. Once he has the suit, he goes on a tear through the Rogues Gallery and doesn't lose, but he does lose to Miles. I love this scene and I love this fight, but again, Craven is the strongest villain the two have faced, and Peter needed the symbiote to win, and Miles just beat the symbiote, so what does that imply? Either way, Peter is ultimately the one to take the suit off, and it's a justified loss, so let's put a pin in that for now because Peter loses once again against Venom. He's thrown through a wall and is knocked out for the entire night. I consider this, even if it is a minor infraction, an unjustified loss, and
Again, it's just so lazy. It's like, he's tired now. He's sleepy. That's why he can't help now. It's just so lazy. It's so lazy. And when lazy writing, at least for me, maybe other people aren't like this, but for me, when there's really, really lazy writing like that, it just makes me check out. Like, I don't take it seriously anymore. I'm just like, is this what we're doing? Really? Okay, sure. Like, I mentally check out.
it's done so we can have the coolest level in the game. I wish the game justified it by claiming that after taking off the suit, the fatigue caught up with him all at once, but we don't really get that, so unjustified. Now we arrive at the main attraction, the fridge scene. Oh man, where do we begin? Okay, so I understand that a fridge is deceptively heavy, easily around 300 pounds, but I think the problem with this scene is that Peter is wholly off his game, and let's break it down. For starters, I don't think it was irrational for MJ to jump in front of Peter. She loves him, but it does come across as her having faster reaction time.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Just the face. The face. It's so scary. I do think this is a good point though that he's bringing up. The fact that MJ jumped in front of him suggests that she has faster reaction times than Spider-Man, who has famously amazingly fast reaction times. So even if she did jump in front of him, I think he would have the reaction time to move her out of the way to not let her take a slam from a giant alien. To make sure that she didn't take the slam of a giant alien creature straight to the dome. But like, what are we doing? Like, again, it's just very, very, very contrived and stupid.
Reaction time.
WTF, even his Spidey sense at this point, bro. No, you don't get hit by Venom. You're sexy.
Than him. Then Peter's head hit the fridge, then the floor, then the fridge again, and I'll admit, that's brutal. Worse, however, is Peter then gets up when MJ is taken and stares at Venom while she is literally being suffocated by the symbiote. Listen to this! Don't. All he says is, don't. Like, bro, fucking do something! What are you
Yeah, it's pretty stupid.
saying? Part of what frustrates me with this scene is that it's an unjustified loss, and it would be so easy to make it justified while maintaining the core of the scene. We can keep MJ jumping in front of Peter. Some consider it stupid of her, but again, it's natural when you love someone. And it's not like MJ isn't already in direct danger by simply being the only non-superpowered person in the house. Instead, however, Peter can push her out of the way, causing the tendril to not hit him, but grab him. The tendril can wrap around his neck, and then while virtually subdued, Venom uses the other arm to drag MJ away. Then he can keep his plea for Harry to not do it and not look like a bum for just standing there watching. Regardless, this is an unjustified loss. There's plenty of ways to justify it if we bring in outside information or make significant assumptions, but in a vacuum, this is a near undeniable unjustified loss. The next loss is at City Hall, and it's once again due.
And this is what's always so amazing to me, is that YouTubers are able to, off the dome, come up with objectively better ways of constructing these scenes such that they don't have these massive plot holes. And it's not even what like the YouTuber does. The YouTuber doesn't write stories for games. The YouTuber isn't like just a dude making videos, but that is objectively better than what is in the game by like every metric. It's just way better. And yet the writers, the professional writers, couldn't come up with a solution to it. Like, what are we doing? What are we doing? And I have to conclude that the writers are either they didn't see this as a problem, they thought it was badass, or God forbid, they thought that this was like the badass version. That it's like, no, it's intense because the fridge hurts. Like, it's kindergarten writing. Like, what are we doing? I don't know. I don't know how it happened, but it feels like, especially during this period, of the last like 5 years, there's been a significant drop in writing quality with a lot of these big AAA studios. Some people point to like SBI consultancy work and stuff. The people I've chatted with who work in game development on projects that SBI was involved in, they said that it was like their involvement was very, very minimal, and like they showed up, gave recommendations, and then nobody ever talked to them ever again. I don't know if that's the case for every one of these games that they worked on, because they did work on Spider-Man 2 or consult on it at least a little bit. I think more than anything, it just seems like there's a generation of writers that got hired right after COVID that are all terrible. They're just bad at what they do. Like, I don't know how else to conclude it. Like, even if you're like, well, SBI was involved and they made recommendations that were terrible, it's still the writer's fault for taking their advice. Like, if you come in and you say, hey, we're going to redo The Last of Us Part 3, Joel is going to come back as a zombie, but he's going to come back as a zombie and it's going to be an allegory for Jesus. So he's going to come back as like raised from the dead, but then he's going to lead an army of enlightened infected, and they're going to retake the world, and he's going to create a tribulation. Like, you start describing this stuff and it's just insane. The writers would still have to say, yeah, that sounds good, let's do that. And so even if the consultant is making stupid recommendations, the writers are still responsible for taking the bad advice. You know, it's why you can't just excuse away like Suicide Squad being god awful with writing by saying, well, Sweet Baby worked on it. The writers still agreed to do that. So the people that worked at Rocksteady are still responsible ultimately. You know, you can't just wave your hands away. I'm saying the writers still said yes, even if it is ultimately SBI who came up with the idea. The writers are still bad for saying that sounds good. That sounds like a great idea. In the case of Spider-Man 2, though, like these little things, these individual scenes, that's not stuff that SBI worked on. They gave like character arc descriptions. They came up with like character designs. They came up with, we think we should work this character in this way. They should have these interests to appeal to these people. Like that's what their consultancy groups work on. My understanding is that like individual scenes are still being written by the writers at Insomniac. I think the writers are just bad. They're just bad.
To the general incompetence on the part of both Spider-Men. Peter puts up hardly any fight against the infected, and conveniently has no sound gadgets, which are canon as they were developed as part of a different earlier mission. Then Miles jumps in, and instead of using electricity, or anything really, he just tugs on him a bunch. Now, granted, we can see multiple tendrils begin to pin Peter down as soon as he hits the ground, so it's hard to call this entirely unjustified, so we can simply leave it as neutral, as once again, it's to make Mr. Negative the hero. When Peter encounters Harry again,
and again, this is just the tale of the tape time and time and time again with Spider-Man 2 specifically, the game, is that you can tell they decided we need this guy to be the hero of the scene, or we need MJ to be the hero. We need Miles to be the hero, whatever it may be. And then they come up with a way for it to happen and they just force it. They don't even try to make it make sense. They don't even come up with some explanation for why Miles couldn't use some of his powers in that scene, why they wouldn't have these gadgets or this capability this way or that way, because that doesn't work. That they don't need to. They feel like it's good enough, and that reflects the overall impression of Spider-Man 2, which is again that it was just good enough, no more, no less.
He, despite having anti-venom, hardly puts up a fight against Harry. Perhaps this is because he is clearly still conflicted over having to fight his friend, but the entire plan of entering his base and basically forcing himself to be saved by Miles was completely foolish, and seemed a contrivance so Peter knows where the meteorite is. Unjustified loss. Finally, Peter in his final encounter has the effects of anti-venom change moment to moment. Now, this makes some sense from a writing perspective because anti-venom is the most blatant plot device ever, but especially in the case of when Venom defeats him after his second phase, he hardly resists him. What could he do to escape? Maybe the thing he did not even a minute ago when he was in the exact same situation. Again, this could easily be changed to have Venom stop the fight midway because he senses that the meteorite is gone, and Peter can struggle to keep up with him because he just flies away. Unjustified loss. Also, we know anti-venom is strong enough to do this, so it feels like the capabilities of anti-venom are all over the place. Our final total is 7 unjustified losses and 2 justified losses. That is significantly more than the first game. However, I don't think this is the whole picture, because if it was, we'd see similar complaints to a smaller extent with the first game, but we don't. In order to determine another aspect of how Spider-Man feels nerfed, we can shift away from the narrative and look at the actual gameplay, because a significant amount of time is spent as Peter, even when we have Miles alongside us, but significantly less time is spent as Spider-Man. The following argument is going to require quite the helping of salt, because when we factor in numbers for gameplay, we run into the issue of variability. What if my playthrough looked a little different than yours, and what if I spent more time on X than Y? So consider these rough estimates, and as you'll see, the grain of salt won't affect the outcome very much. The way we are going to evaluate a playthrough is by how much time is spent as Spider-Man and how much time is spent as Peter or another character that isn't Spider-Man. In the first game, we can see my 8-hour and 25-minute playthrough. We have 5 hours and 38 minutes under the mask, and the rest, 2 hours and 38 minutes, is spent as a normal human. That means 65% of the game is spent as Spider-Man. Let's compare this to Spider-Man 2. For this game, we'll be counting gameplay as Miles as non-Spider-Man gameplay, because a lot of the sentiment that Peter was nerfed is heightened by people feeling like Miles was forced down their throat.
Yeah, and that's why I've also said that it does a disservice to Miles by doing it, where it's like, you could have given him his own game, a spin-off game, whatever. Like, you could have done your own thing there, but instead you try to cram all of it together. And like, if you really believe that MJ is just as badass as Spider-Man, why is there not an MJ game? It's because you know it wouldn't sell. It's because you know nobody would be interested in that, because she's not as cool as Spider-Man. Like, this is not rocket science, okay? Maybe that's problematic of me to say, but MJ is not as cool or fun or interesting as Spider-Man. That's why it's called Spider-Man and not MJ and the Adventures of Spider-Man. It's Spider-Man, okay? And whenever you start to try to cram all of this together, it just waters down the overall experience for everything. You know, I agree. You shouldn't discount Miles. My point is that by making Miles like I mean, you know what another good example is? Another good example. It's like AC Odyssey or AC Syndicate, to use those as examples, where The original vision was for Cassandra to be the only protagonist in AC Odyssey. And then it was, I forget his name, the one of the executives at Ubisoft. He was eventually fired and literally found guilty in a court of law for psychological abuse. It's like a whole thing. But that guy said, no, women don't sell, which is a wild thing to say. And he forced them to put in a dual protagonist thing of Alexios and Cassandra, and then they weave them into the story, so you run into the other one. If you choose one or the other, you eventually run into everything. And I think it pretty clearly did a disservice to Cassandra to have a secondary protagonist that wasn't needed, and it did a disservice to Alexios as well, because now he didn't get the same attention he would have gotten otherwise as a protagonist, because he was playing second fiddle to what was the real protagonist. It didn't actually help at the end of the day, either character live up to their utmost potential. And in the case of Spider-Man and Miles Morales, as Spider-Man as well, doing like the dual protagonist thing, especially in the context of a video game where they share similar abilities, traversal, all of that, inevitably it just kind of waters down the experience for both characters. They end up just falling a bit more flat and not being as interesting as they would have otherwise been. I think if you had done Spider-Man 2 and it's a game focused on Peter Parker's Spider-Man, following the same storylines and everything as the first game, and then you give Miles Morales his own Spider-Man game, that distinguishes them, gives them the chance to be the center of their own stories, to have the entire game's arc focused on that character instead of trying to weave all this stuff together. That I think works way, way better than trying to cram it all into one package, in my opinion.
Also, a minor stipulation, I am considering the small segment where you go undercover in Kraven's house as a Spider-Man segment because it is directly tied to Spider-Man's goal and is meant to show off the Black Suit's capabilities. Here are what the numbers come out to. The entire story took me about 9 hours and 50 minutes. Of that time, 5 hours, just barely over half, was
Bear in mind, again, this is a $300 million game. $300 million for 9 hours, 50 minutes of gameplay time.
Spent as Spider-Man. 1 hour and 10 minutes was spent as Peter, 30 minutes was spent as Mary Jane, a surprisingly small amount of time, and 2 hours and 50 minutes was spent as Miles. This means that 52%, or otherwise half of the game, is spent playing as someone who is not Peter Parker's Spider-Man. Now granted, I didn't include the Venom mission in the statistics because I don't really think anyone had a problem with it. In fact, despite the mission only being 15 minutes, it's probably still the highlight of the game. That is still an absurd number. I think it's interesting that despite the narrative otherwise, we actually spend far less time as non-powered humans in this game than we did in the first game.
But I think that the fact that now when people think back to Spider-Man 2 and they think of the Mary Jane sequences and the walking around, riding a bicycle, they think of those sequences. I think that shows how significant those moments are. That they take up a disproportionate amount of like brain space and memory for the game, which is, I think, a big deal. Like when I think of The Witcher 3, I'm genuinely interested in chat. Tell me, what do you think of? Like, what area of the map, what do you see in your mind's eye, when you think of The Witcher 3? Because I think of Skellige specifically. I think of exploring Skellige. I also have very clear and vivid memories of Toussaint and specifically the villa and spending a lot of time doing upgrades and that type of thing. But that's what I think of. When I think of Spider-Man 2, I think of the weird ketchup and mustard Venom lady that MJ becomes. And I think of like these sequences stealthing as MJ, which I don't think was the goal, Bloody Baron, that's a good answer, frankly. That's a good answer. The brothel, how dare you, 53 Nights, get out of here. How dare you, you sly dog. It's like, what do you think of when you think of GTA 5? The strip club. Instantly. Yep, instantly. It's like, okay, that's sad. Okay, anyway, continuing. But I think that that's true of a lot of games, though, is that there are certain moments that have disproportional impact on the player experience for positive and negative, right? You can have moments that are disproportionately awesome and people will remember those moments no matter what. Even if the rest of the game was kind of like, meh, that one moment was so badass that that's what they kind of think of. And in the case of something like Spider-Man 2, it's some bad moments are what people think of. Or Forspoken had a lot of cool combat moments, gameplay moments, as I mentioned earlier, but it's so overwhelmingly defined by cringy dialogue between the girl and the cuff, and weird dialogue where she's talking to the judge after committing another, I think, robbery is what it was. And she's like, no, but I have a bright future. And I'm like, anybody who says they have a bright future, unironically, probably doesn't. Hate to be that guy. I have a bright future. If you have to say that, you probably don't. You know, but that's all anybody can think of now because it was so disproportionately awful that that's what people think of when they think of that game. Anyway, continuing.
That's not exactly the point. Many people have issues with how much time is spent as Miles or MJ, and they aren't exactly wrong in those issues. Side note, just thought it was interesting, we spend a total of 1 hour and 45 minutes in the black suit. That is not good. So, what's the conclusion then? Peter was nerfed? I mean, narratively, he's losing much more and for shakier reasons, and he is less present in this game than he was in his debut. But something doesn't sit right with me. There's something about what we've covered that still doesn't present Insomniac as an entity hell-bent on minimizing Peter. Of course, you see the runtime, we have a bit more to cover, and no video essay is complete without a good twist.
What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck bumble.
While I was taking my time going through the first 2 games, I figured why not do the same calculations for Miles and see where he stacks up. The Miles Morales game took about 4 hours and 22 minutes to complete, with about 53 of those minutes being outside of the mask, and 3.5 hours under. That means 83% of the game is under the mask, the highest density of Spider-Manning so far. More interesting, however, is how...
And I really liked it. I think Miles Morales, especially as like a Christmas game, themed around winter, it's genuinely pretty good.
And when Miles loses. Miles is a total newbie in this game, which makes a lot of his incompetence justified. Mostly. He loses to Finn after chasing her, and this is a weird loss because while he could melt her tools with his electricity, as showcased on the bridge, he might be hesitant because that's his friend. Then he justifiably loses to Rhino because he is ambushed, outnumbered, and he has new armor that negates his electricity powers. Then he loses to Finn again in the subway tunnel, though he's not really putting up a fight, instead trying to reason with her. And that's it. Miles doesn't lose often, and 2 out of the 3 times he does, you can make a reasonable argument that he wasn't even trying to win. Spider-Man 2 is a different story. Miles would have been eaten by Sandman, but is saved by Peter, much in the same way Peter saved him. Miles loses instantly to Scorpion, much in the same way that Peter did in the first game. You could say Miles fails to catch Lee in this scene, but it was a joint effort and Peter made the call to let him go, so I don't count this one. He loses when captured by the Hunters, and I think this is pretty justified. He loses when trying to save Peter in possibly the greatest display of incompetence, and finally, he loses to Venom, or would have lost if he wasn't saved by MJ. So he loses 5 times, and only once is it justified. He still loses less than Peter, but he doesn't have as much screen time. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, I'd say Insomniac didn't necessarily nerf Peter, they nerfed the writers. Despite a lot of the core directorial team,
All the writing is lazy. That's why, like, we can say, as I think some people have mentioned, where it's like, it feels like they're nerfing him purposefully. And it's like, yeah, at certain moments, I think they are contriving storylines and they are weakening him so that another character can be lifted up in his place. I think that definitely does happen repeatedly across the board. But just in general, like they're not trying to come up with an excuse that makes sense. They're not really trying. The writing quality has just plummeted. Like the writers are just bad. They're just bad and they're lazy. And that's one thing, like there's contrived stories and those can still be compelling and interesting, but you just kind of ignore that part, shut that part of your brain off and just don't think about it. You can still have a good time though. But then there's other times where like the writers literally are not trying or they just are incapable of doing it. And, you know, you look at the writing in Starfield where it's like, it really feels like you guys are just not capable of writing a story that's compelling in this way. It's just all so bland and boring. Bland and boring is bad, but contrived and stupid is a whole other animal. I don't know which is worse, frankly.
Remaining consistent across the 3 games, all 3 Spider-Man games have had mostly different writers. This is why the games vary so widely, not just in terms of writing quality, but writing quirks. However, there is one quirk that seems to permeate through a lot of the games, and that's the way they present power. Insomniac never makes a character powerful through giving them strength. Instead, they make the protagonist weak. That's why Miles' electricity can sometimes melt metal away when it's convenient and suddenly do nothing when it isn't. It's why Kraven kills half the Sinister Six off screen, and why we see him kill Scorpion. It shows the player that he's a real threat, and when we want to make Venom look like a threat, he kills Kraven and makes Peter look like a bitch. It's not exclusive to Peter either. Scorpion is mogged, Vulture is deathmaxing off screen, and even Kraven is conveniently spared in his first encounter with symbiote Peter. I think a lot of this comes down to the writing process where writers say, okay, we need Peter to be in X position so that Y can happen. But little consideration is given to if it makes sense for how the character gets in that spot. When it comes to why there is so much non-Spider-Man gameplay, I simply think it has to do with Brian Intihar as a director. Peter Parker is literally half the reason Spider-Man is so cool. And
it started with the idea of Spider-Man and Peter Parker's world colliding. That was the start of everything. He's also said some really, 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 really stupid stuff, like saying that MJ is just like, hold on, I want to get the quote right. Because it was so dumb that I was like, there's no way.
If she's a little OP, I don't give a shit. She's fine. I don't care. I wanted her. I felt like it would be taking the easy way out if we didn't make her play. To the point where I said, we're gonna do it. I don't care. We'll cut other stuff because I want to make sure that it's important to show her be a capable
hero. That cuts off at the end. But yeah, he literally said, I don't care, we're gonna do it, we'll cut other stuff, in a game that most people feel was lacking other stuff. And he's cutting stuff and changing stuff just to have MJ show up as a capable hero. And I'm sorry, she's in a game with two different Spider-Man. Like, she's in a game with Spider-Man and Spider-Man Miles Morales. Like, she's in a game with two different Spider-Men. She is not a capable hero on paper. Like, maybe that makes me a bad person, but like, I'm sorry. Can she climb a wall? Can she shoot webs? Can she lift a refrigerator? Okay. So she's not, I get it. It's not all about strength. And what he'd probably say is, no, it's because you can be a hero even if you don't have superpowers. Okay, cool. But it's a Spider-Man game. Like, what are we doing? Okay, that makes me feel warm and fuzzy. That's great. But that's also very dumb. Okay, like, what are we doing? And I think that it's just like the obsession with trying to get her in the game and playable and show her as a capable hero. You can feel how some things start to feel really forced, where he's saying, I don't care if it doesn't make sense. I don't care what the excuse is. We're going to do it. Full stop. And you start to feel how it feels forced and it doesn't feel justified. And it's like comes out of nowhere and it comes from the top, you know, it's a broader directorial demand.
Brian Intihar has always maintained that he wants to showcase that side of him, specifically because they are two sides of the same coin. This isn't a bad thing necessarily, but it is still at the core of the stories Intihar wants to tell. There's a particular interview clip that comes up a lot in these conversations where he says he will double down on the MJ missions.
I could have just waited.
The MJ missions, where do I begin? I heard all the feedback, and I will tell you, I felt like it was a cop-out if we didn't have them.
Yeah.
I felt like we were saying, okay, yep, everybody just wants to see Spider-Man and whatever. Like, who cares about the perspective of seeing the world from a non-superhero standpoint? I was like, whatever. And
it's a Spider-Man game. It's a Spider-Man game. What are we doing crossing our arms and pouting? Like, bro, it's a Spider-Man game. And your audience and fans say they thought that the MJ sequences felt out of place. They were boring. It's a Spider-Man game. Why are we playing as MJ? What are we doing? It's this like contempt for the audience that is so representative of the last like 5 years of some of these like biggest flops in the industry. And it's why, again, like I said at the top of the video, I think if Spider-Man 2 had launched a year or two later in the age of like 2024, early 2025, for example, I think it would have been crucified for some of the writing choices and what they've done with it. It still probably would have sold pretty well because it's Spider-Man, but I think that it would have gotten a lot more blowback than it did at the time. And I'm sorry, it's just this weird contemptuous vibe of like, No, you guys, what you want is a cop out. What you want, you don't understand. It's talking down to, it's just, it feels gross.
And I said, no, we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it. We're gonna look at the criticisms and see what we can do right. And I think that it was really important to show that she is a capable hero in her own way.
For sure.
Give people the stuff they want, so you can inject things that maybe they aren't familiar with, or maybe they don't know they want, but make them like that stuff.
To be clear, as he says on screen for those listening, this quote is in reference to Mr. Negative, but many people believe it to be indicative of the MJ missions too, because it has to do with his design philosophy. Just to let him read it off again, this is the methodology and the mindset of a lot of these guys. Just listen again.
Own way.
For sure.
Give people the stuff they want, so you can inject things that maybe they aren't familiar with, or maybe they don't know they want, but make them like that stuff.
It's hard to...
This like manipulative... You don't like the MJ stuff? Okay, well, you're gonna. You don't like the MJ missions? You think they're boring and out of place in a game called Spider-Man? Okay, well, you're gonna. We're gonna put it in the game. Yes, you'll play as Spider-Man. You'll swing around. You'll punch bad guys. And we'll even give you a second Spider-Man. You can... 2 Spider-Man. Fighting crime, doing great things. And we're gonna put MJ sequences in there, and you're gonna like it. It's that, again, contempt. It's just gross to me. It's manipulative. It's like, no, we're gonna sneak it in there, and it's literally, it's literally, you order a smoothie and they sneak kale into it and they grind it up, and like, you can't even really tell. It's like, it tastes like I licked the ass cheek of an elephant. I can tell there's kale in my smoothie. I wanted a good smoothie that tastes good. I didn't want you to shove whatever the hell this is into it, you know? This is the kale in the smoothie.
Not feel put off by this, and while I do think the reaction to this has been overblown, I certainly don't think he's saying fuck the fans, and rather saying, I hear you, we will do them again, but this time better. And when it came to MJ, they were better, but I still think this is indicative of how he directs, and Spider-Man Miles Morales supports this. That game had the least amount of screen time featuring a character outside of the suit, and conveniently, Intihar didn't direct that one. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, because eventually this will just turn into a story critique, and I don't want this to seem like I'm hating, okay? I still consider Brian Intihar to be video game Jesus Christ, and Insomniac as a whole goats for finally giving us a great Spider-Man game, but I want to clarify a few things as we wrap up. I don't believe Peter himself was maliciously nerfed. I don't think the people that do think that are wrong. In fact, all evidence points to them being somewhat right. But I personally, in my heart of hearts, don't get that impression. I know the discourse around these games can get heated at times, and I want to say that all of these games, especially Spider-Man 2, are flawed and are worthy of critiquing, but I still love them dearly. I play Spider-Man 2 a few times a week. I love just swinging around, enjoying the vibes, and poor writing or inconsistencies don't change that. While I now believe that Peter was in some ways nerfed, I don't think it was in service of Miles. Yes, Miles suffers from the writing issues less than Peter, especially in his own game, but I think we got here due to a combination of this being a primarily Peter-driven story, and Insomniac wanting to show how awesome it is to have 2 Spider-Men.
There's a saying, never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by incompetence. And I think that is largely a good saying to bear in mind with a lot of these discussions, because what is an easier explanation for like the fridge scene that Peter gets knocked down by a refrigerator and like lets MJ jump in front of him to take the blow of an alien? What's better? Like, what makes more sense? That it was this like calculated thing with like, yeah, and then we're gonna have him get squished by the refrigerator as like a humiliation thing to say that like MJ took that hit and was still awake and fine, but Peter gets knocked to the ground by a fridge falling on him. How stupid is that? Screw him. Like, I don't think that's it. I think they just like were lazy writers and were like, I don't know, she gets hit, he slams into the fridge and it like falls on him, and then he like throws it up and gets up and goes, don't, and then she shows up as ketchup alien, and I really think that's it. There's like no second pass on the story. There's been a lot of discussion in the last few years over like a culture of toxic positivity, for example, in the writer's room, and I think that is just as significant of an explanation or just as valid an explanation of a lot of this stuff, because it feels like with many of these stories that have god awful writing, it feels like did nobody check this? Did nobody go over this again? Did nobody go back and look at this and ask, is this the best we can do? And I think it's because like genuinely nobody did. I think it genuinely is that. I think there's other things and other problems where like we watch the clips of Saints Row reboot where you see that cast of characters talking about, eat the rich and screw the patriarchy and talking about their student loans. And it's so cringy. It's just so unbelievably bad. But we watch that and it's super cringy, and we're trying to figure out how did this happen? Did they think this was cool? Like, did they think that this was relatable?
You know, as far as hired killers go, I'd give them a 7.
You look like you could use a mimosa.
Thanks, Eli.
Seriously, how's the job?
It's the murder business. The fundamentals don't change, just the uniform.
I can tell you love it.
Okay, I don't have to love it. I have to pay my student loans.
Poof, I'm in.
So I'm guessing that means the pay's good.
It's supposed to be. Got stiffed on my bonus today.
Dude, what the fuck?
I played a little fast and loose on the job, and, well, my CO wasn't a fan.
You gotta be kidding me.
Swear to God, this lady walked right off the set of an 80s action.
So we look at that and we go, how did the writers write that scene and say that is ready to ship? That is the best we can do. Those people are relatable. And I think it's because they actually do truly believe that. At some point, when somebody tells you they think something is good, you should believe them. If somebody tells you this is the best we can do, this is awesome, you should believe them. If somebody tells you they think that these characters are relatable because they share similar experiences, they're just like me. If the writer tells you that, you should believe them. I think a lot of these writers that came out of school in that like COVID era, post-COVID era, and started doing, I don't know if it was just remote workers and they were able to hire these writers for cheap. I genuinely don't know what caused this wave. But companies across the world started hiring writers that are largely incompetent, are insanely lazy as well, as we've seen throughout this whole discussion. And they just frankly, like, it's really dangerous when the leaders and the people in charge of those writers also have this like contempt for an audience or for their own audience as it pertains to the narrative, which I think also happens a lot. It happened with Saints Row, where they had this weird contempt over this like sort of irreverent, raunchy humor that the previous Saints Row games were known for. And then with Spider-Man, there's also, like I said, that same feeling of contempt of like, I'm going to show you this stuff that you don't think you want, but you're going to like it. And it's just kind of icky. It's just icky. It makes me feel icky.
Can't prove it, obviously, but I do believe that it's meant to say, look how much more they can do, instead of, look how useless one is without the other. I think it's unfortunate that a lot of bad actors have really hopped on the trend of saying Peter was nerfed, because ultimately, I think it leads to a lot of bad faith criticism, and it paves the way for hundreds of assumptions that make engaging with the game's discourse toxic and unenjoyable. But unfortunately, even if some of the people who believe this can be jackasses, in this particular case, they're also correct. Once again, feel free to check out the second channel for more Spider-Man and Batman content. Thank you to our patrons for supporting this channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
It's a very good video. I mean, I think he is right that I don't think that the writers sat down and decided, let's nerf Peter to build up MJ, let's nerf Peter to build up Miles. I think that they wanted to build up MJ and Miles, and because they're bad writers, it ended up tearing down whatever character was at the centerpiece of the scene in order to build up the other people. It's sort of a cart before the horse thing, carrot and the stick, whatever. I think that they wanted to lift up MJ as a capable hero, just as capable as Miles, which is stupid, but that's what they wanted to do. And they did that at the cost of the other characters, but that was mainly because of incompetence, not necessarily calculated malice. Does it ultimately matter at the end of the day? Not really. Either way, at the end of the day, the stories are still stupid. So there's that. But I hope that they take the feedback from Spider-Man 2 and listen to it and can grow from it. It's just a matter of time before we see if they do. For Wolverine, I think that the tone is much, much different. So I'm more optimistic about that. Spider-Man has always been kind of tough to juggle because you start to add in these secondary characters. You start to add in other, like another Spider-Man in the form of Miles, and that can also mean that you're juggling a lot. So I'm not sure how this plays out and how this will settle in the next game, but hopefully at least they listen to some of the feedback. Cordell, thank you for the 5. I disagree that Miles being there hurt the game. Some of the side missions hurt it more. Do I think Miles being there hurt the game? I think the way that he was there undermined his own involvement and Peter's. I don't know if it hurt the game. Like if the game was, I think there's a version of Spider-Man 2 that was like Peter's Spider-Man that would have been very good, if not better. And I think that there's a version of Spider-Man 2 where it was just Miles, or Spider-Man 3 or whatever, where it's just Miles, that also could have been very good. I think that the way, and given their capabilities, writing capabilities, the way that they integrated the two Spider-Man and MJ, just it undermined their own efforts, and it watered down the experience for everybody. You know, yeah. Plenty of games have incredible writing. Don't treat the audience like they're idiots, and you have a baseline competent game. Yeah, well, and it's the respect for the audience that I really crave. It's why I love Expedition 33 and KCD and KCD2, and it's because those games expect their audience to think about the dialogue, to appreciate what's going on, to investigate the world more, and they don't feel the need to like hold the characters' hands or force things. It just works very, very different. Miles should have gotten on Peter's case for stealing his drip. That would be funny. That would have been funny. Yeah. We'll see. It's the same superhero writing we've seen since the 90s, to be honest. Some action movies and games are more about the action, let's be honest. Well, and I mean, pretty clearly they sold a lot of copies. They did what they needed to do for Spider-Man 2. As far as I understand it, it was a profitable sequel. It's just a sequel that cost $300 million, and they don't think is that sustainable long term, which I think is probably true. I think it's probably true that you can't do another $300 million game like this and have it find profitability. It probably doesn't work. But my understanding is that they made their money back on it. It's just they'd much rather do a $100 million game that makes 300 than a $300 million game that makes 300. You know, Hammond, gotta say, if you expect Oscar writing in a game, that's a problem. Doesn't mean it should be bad, though. I mean, I think you should expect good writing, and it doesn't mean that every game is going to have writing that makes you rethink your life or anything like that. But I do think that it's okay for players to expect more. I think that's totally fine. I think the last thing we should be doing is lowering the standards. The biggest compliment for Spider-Man PS4 was that it felt like a love letter to fans. Spider-Man 2 felt like a love letter to Brian Intihar. Well, it's the moment that you start to disregard and cast aside your fans' feedback because you feel you know what's better for them. That's when you get into a slippery area where you could start to really screw things up, because sometimes the fans are right. Shocker, right? If the fans tell you, I don't like this, maybe you should say, yeah, I get it. I listen to the feedback. Like once you start dismissing feedback, you end up with Starfield. You know, that's what happens. With the budget that some of these games have and how much more cinematic many of them are, the writing should be good when the writers, when we have writers that are fully capable. Well, I agree. And that's why I genuinely don't know what happened where all these companies started hiring people that are just bad at writing, but they're being hired as writers. Like, I just genuinely don't know. Because again, you can point to consultancy groups, but there still are writers on staff at these companies. Because how it works is that you have a team of like 15 writers at the studio, or 10 writers or 5 writers, whatever it is. And they work at the studio day in, day out, writing stuff. And then you have consultancy groups that might come in and visit and offer feedback, be like, oh, you should do this. And then they leave. But you have the people on staff that are writing the actual dialogue and doing that stuff. So yeah, they could get feedback from this group that came in to consult, and that feedback is probably bad and stupid. But the writers are still the ones writing it. They're the ones that were hired. And in the case of like Dragon Age of Veilguard, they ended up firing literally every single person. Like every person that's in the credits of Dragon Age Veilguard as a writer no longer works at BioWare. They got rid of all of them. And I think that that is a saving grace and perhaps something to just go in peace with, which is that the feedback has been overwhelmingly heard from these executives, because the one thing executives love a lot more, a lot more than feeling virtuous is money. And if they feel like their game is going to flop because of bad writing, they will fire every single writer on staff and figure something else out. Now they work everywhere else or at Starbucks. And that might sound pointed, but it's because I do know somebody. I know of somebody, I don't know them, but I know of somebody who was laid off from a writing position who was, in my opinion, not great. And they are currently working at a Starbucks. Starbucks can be great. Can be a great place to work. Don't get me wrong. But some of these people were literally booted out of the industry. Because once, like, imagine you worked as a writer on like Dragon Age and everybody knows the writing was the weakest part of that game. The writing is why that failed. The writing is this or that. Everybody knows the writing was the problem. And then you come in looking for a job and on your resume, you say writer for that game that failed because of the writing. Not many companies are going to want to hire you. Like some maybe will, but not a lot of them will. BGS will. They did hire one guy. But like, can you blame him? Like, it's the same thing. Like, you know, the director, sorry, this is a deep cut, but do you know the director who did like some of the most successful games or successful movies and like highly awarded movies for a very long period of time? Okay. This is a guy that directed The King's Speech. He directed Les Miserables. He directed across the two of those won 4 Golden Globes, 11 BAFTAs, and 7 Oscars. He directed The Danish Girl, and then he did one other movie. Do you know what? Kato Mance guy knows it. I'm talking about Hooper, Tom Hooper. And he isn't a very, very accomplished director, but he made one oopsie. He made Cats. Cats, the musical movie, in 2019. And it was such a disaster. He's basically been completely shut out of the industry. Like retired, gone. Because if he needs to go to a studio and be like, hey, I want to make another movie. They're like, okay, what have you done? He can list off these good things. And he's like, yeah, and I made Cats. Do you think anybody's giving him money? No. So it's the same thing that happens in every creative field. If you have your name attached to something that was a disaster, not many companies are going to want to give you lots of money. Just how it works. They don't have a lot of confidence in you. And I think the same thing is happening with a lot of the people who wrote some of these big flops through the last 5 years, you know, because a lot of companies and executives are like, we do not want to have a flop on our hands because we decided to hire a writer who has contempt for the audience or this or that. Unless you're Disney. Oh, even Disney, it looks like Disney has actually done a lot of work in the background quietly, but they've laid off a ton of people who were in charge of some of these programs that people think led to the direction a lot of their shows and movies went. And for them, they'll be much more quiet and tactical with it. They won't broadcast it publicly for obvious reasons. But a lot of these companies are starting to try and make adjustments. Because again, the one thing the executives love a lot more than feeling virtuous and like good people fighting the good fight, the one thing they love a lot more than that is money. The one thing they hate more than feeling like a bad person who's not an ally, the thing they hate more than anything is losing money. They don't want to lose money. God forbid. Netflix, on the other hand, yeah, they'll do whatever the hell. They don't care. They have enough money that they're like, I don't care. Whatever. Oh, no. Whatever. He took my thing.